Today I will be talking about history. This is going to be a discussion somewhat haphazard between the relationship between history and science fiction, and this is something that I came up with while I was thinking of dystopia, while I was thinking of how the whole dystopia idea is dealt with, negotiated by science fiction. So it's a curious, you might think this is somewhat curious to amalgamate the ideas of science fiction, which often look at the future rather than look back. I mean, there are a lot of science fiction which also goes back, time travel, etc. But the history of the future, this is something that science fiction has been dealing with for a long time. In fact, how the future will be, how future history will be, or how the near future would create the further future. So the near future would become the history of the further future. Now this, of course, has nothing to do with time travel. It is completely conjecture fiction. It is completely imagination, that you actually look forward, and looking forward you analyze your own time, your own issues as if they were history. So this is the point that I will be elaborating today. You know, I have this strange obsession with the idea of history, and here, if we look at A Handmaid's Tale, that tale itself is personal history, but that is a history that is in the process of being, that is in the process of becoming, in fact, personal history. You know, when we are dealing with history, the biggest complaint, the biggest issue we have is that history generally refuses to look at the individual. History generally looks at the so-called big picture, right? By looking at this big picture, what history does is that it completely ignores the individual experiences, and there is no felt history. There is data-based history. There are so-called golden ages, but if you think about it, people who are on the ground level, people like me, we have always suffered, we have always had, I mean, of course, I belong to a location of privilege. So people who are not capable or not given even that minute bit of privilege, they have it, their lives are very difficult, and that difficulty is something history refuses to acknowledge. In fact, we celebrate all the great historical feats. We celebrate all the great historical times, all the time forgetting that ordinary people always had it bad. But anyway, so essentially one of the things that science fiction does is that it creates a new perspective. It creates a new possibility, and it makes us compare our own lives with that possibility. If it's utopian, if you think about, say, a number of novels by Arthur C. Clarke or even Isaac Asimov, then you see there are futures predicted which are better than ours, which are quite often ideal. Futures in which money does not matter, futures in which gender issues do not matter, racial issues do not matter. So those futures are there, and in fact they stand as contrast to the problem-filled notions of today. The problems that today gives us. So that is one of the major functions of science fiction, to look at the present by creating one kind of future. And not always is there criticism. Criticism is not always there. There are observations, there are commentaries, there are pure and simple fictional conjectures which tell us that one step wrong we can go somewhere, one step right we can have something else. So those are the things that we are told. If you think about all the, I am not talking about the alien invasion kind of things. Even then, there have been, zombie invasions and alien invasions, and apparently the world has united because there has been a common enemy. And this is a myth that has remained strong for a long time, that people will unite only when there is a powerful common enemy. There are ideas of resistance, these ultra glamorous ideas of resistance. Comic book ideas like V, which translate into television serials, which translate into movies. But these often fail to look at even something like Star Trek or Star Wars, although I promised you I will not be talking TV, but still I kind of end up doing this. These Star Trek, Star Wars kinds of things, they look at different politics. Sometimes these bits of science fiction become the representation of our times in a science fictional manner. So it's not always that the past is criticized or the now is represented for rumination or for different kinds of classification or political thinking. It's not always that. It's often pure and simple representation. Michael Crichton wrote Westworld, even Jurassic Park. If you think about these texts, you would see they talk about human greed ultimately. The science fiction element becomes a symbol of how human greed can destroy humanity. At the end of the day, it becomes all about the hunger, either for money or for power. So that kind of a thing is represented. This is something all fiction represents, and science fiction is not particularly different. But when we are talking about these utopian or dystopian kinds of science fiction, The Handmaid's Tale, we know what kind of a dystopian situation or dystopic situation The Handmaid's Tale represents, and that creates this question: are we looking at a possible future with a history that is curiously recognizable, or are we looking at a representation which shows just, it becomes difficult to ascertain whether the experiences shown in Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale are, bloated. From a Western perspective, they seem exaggerated, but the moment you step in a third world country like India, where the location of women is constantly problematic, then they seem quite terrifyingly recognizable. They do not seem like a distant or a near, or they do not seem futuristic. They seem like the present. So these are the two questions, and in any science fiction text, I believe these two can coexist simultaneously. It does not have to be either or. It can be neither nor, but it doesn't have to be either or. They can be there together. The reason I am talking about all this, apart from the idea of the text being whether the text is the future or the story is something that we are familiar with now, just an exaggeration of the present. That is one question. That is a question that needs a different discussion. But what I thought was very interesting was the absence of a proper history. We know in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale that we are looking at a nation called Gilead, which once upon a time was a very familiar nation, a very powerful nation, one that supposedly is the first nation, sort of a thing. So that evolution of a nation which was supposed to be the land of freedom, the land of opportunity, and which turns into something, at least from a ideological constitutional point of view, something completely opposite of what it professed to be. It turns into something that is the opposite of what it professed to be. And there is a very simple turning point. Apparently there is an assassination, there is a power vacuum created, and because of that vacuum, what happens is one sect, one extremist kind of a political party, a political entity, which is not entirely political, which is primarily religious, but becomes political. That party takes the opportunity of the vacuum in power and takes power. And it establishes a so-called religious stricture, a state that is bound by religion, a state that is bound by not only religion, there are religious entities everywhere, but it is almost cataclysmic, it is almost, uncontrollable, or rather it is far too controlled an existence that is created. It becomes a fascist kind of a state, although fascism is another idea. It's a political idea, but when we are talking about a religion-centric dominion, we have another kind of absolutist idea. And in that idea, the first things that are sacrificed are, of course, so-called human rights. Now, one term that you have been hearing constantly in recent times is the idea of the post-human. Now, I am not going to talk about the post-human. The post-human is not exactly within the scope of this discussion or when we are talking about history. But the human is something that gets redefined. And this is where I come to the idea of history, because humanism, humanity, the idea of the individual human being is a historical construct. It is something that we have been taught. The ideas of human rights, the idea of independence, individual freedom, these I would say are all historical ideas because they have been there. We have been taught that this is what it means to be free. And to be free, we are rarely taught that we have to give that freedom to others as well. There is no ideal state of freedom where one individual is free but the other individual is not. Where there can be any kind of slavery, that slavery may have some other name. It might be bonded labor, it might be minimum wages, it might be anything. But such a thing is not freedom. History has taught us what freedom is. And for any absolutist structure, I am avoiding certain words quite consciously because of the political scenarios that the world is going through right now. But anyway, so these ideas, these absolutist structures, what they do is that the first thing that they do, in fact, is to try to obliterate history. They try to tell you there is no history but what is. Because history, like the future, also is a repository of possibilities. There are different systems in history, there are different experimentations, because like an organism, humanity, human civilization also evolves with different kinds of experimentations. And history is the record of all those experimentations, and that is why history does not really focus on the individual, because it deals with the so-called bigger picture. And here, this absence of history, how did this state come into being? This is a question you are not encouraged to ask. In fact, you are discouraged, you are punished if you ask, you are told, again another term that you are quite familiar with, you are told a number of post-truths, you have a lot of noise. Noise is good because when you have a lot of noise, your thinking faculties suffer a little. You cannot think when there is a lot of noise. Noise is good for some people. So there is a lot of noise and there is a lot of suffering. If you are in constant struggle to survive, then you are not thinking of political ideologies, you are not thinking of history. What you are thinking of is pure and simple individual survival. And that is something that you have in Atwood's novel. Although it does not really focus on the larger events or how the entire structure works. You are given perhaps sketchy details, you are given certain clues to how the whole thing works. What you are given is an individual's response to the whole thing, an individual's experiences, an individual's sufferings. But what is unsaid becomes as significant as what is said. We are supposed to read the unwritten as well as that is written. The subtext becomes perhaps even more significant than the text. The text has specific issues. I mean, we have celebrated the novel because of the gender issues, and that is the right on your face kind of a thing. That is the most evident, obvious thing. But the greater political structure that is hinted at, that is also extremely relevant. Because one misstep, and you are right in Gilead, you are right where the entire non-masculine gendered population becomes victims of unimaginable oppression. When I say non-masculine genders, I say it quite consciously, because I do not want to say that only women are suffering. You see a woman, you see a few women who are suffering. Somehow or the other, they are oppressed. Men have all the power, as it seems. Some of them are, of course, victims of patriarchy as well, but they have the power to manipulate the system, which women mostly do not. And this is what I am trying to tell you, that this simple bit of history, the formation of Gilead and the structure of Gilead, that is a point of extreme interest, because the formation of Gilead happens now, in our time. Our time is the supposed history of that time, because the assassination that is happening, the events after that is happening, the hardcore religious, the fanatics who are taking over, this is now. And the state of being that we are seeing in The Handmaid's Tale is tomorrow. And that is the point of a lot of dystopic science fiction. Because see, what is Atud saying? That how are these fanatics successful? That is a question. How did they take power? I mean, women are victimized, the other genders are not even allowed to exist. Humanity is put into this very caged kind of existence. And that existence happens because of certain carelessnesses, certain casual attitudes that the history of Gilead shows. There is no history of Gilead. Gilead is, and it wants to be that without a history. It does not try to familiarize people to what was, because what was may become something threatening to what is. This is the first thing about dystopia, the total allergy towards history. And again, if you think about it, the fanaticism that we are talking about, That has always worked. If you look at human history, you need not be extremely history conscious, but your basic idea of history, all the imperial, all the colonial agenda, they have all relied upon religious ideas. Spreading civilization is not only spreading civilization, new education or new technology. It's also about spreading a religion. So that gives you a kind of a license, a kind of an excuse to destroy the freedom of others. Those others may be there with you. I mean, England did not think twice before invading and annexing Ireland or Scotland or something like that, or countries like that, Wales, Cornwall. So the colonial agenda, the colonial project always finds an excuse. The civilizing mission, that they are the ones who are civilized, they do not have the civilization to realize that there are possibilities of other civilizations, other forms, kinds of civilizations, other histories. So that, in fact, the project, the colonizing project of finding out history is mostly to undermine that history rather than to give it any kind of acknowledgement. The distant past can be glorious. There is no problem there. The distant past is feudal, the distant past is imperial, so that is fine. But the immediate past, the past in which things turn, that becomes a problem. But coming back to science fiction, dystopic science fiction, this avoidance of history, it shows by keeping it conspicuously absent, it gives it a kind of implied presence. The omission becomes so obvious that you are supposed to ask why, and you are supposed to look at what has happened. You are supposed to look at how people have always responded emotionally, and religion has always manipulated that emotional response. And so religion by turn has been manipulated by political powers. So that manipulation for an agenda, for a political purpose, that manipulation needs to be hidden, because if history records it faithfully, then after a while that excuse will not function. After a while you will not be able to look at that history, and you will not be able to buy all those propaganda that has been thrown around. So history needs to be rewritten, history needs to be hidden, or so much suffering needs to be included that the whole neo-colonizing project becomes successful. And in this neo-colonizing project, you will see gender becomes a very important thing. Women must be subjugated. Production must become the most relevant thing. And the history of women's movements, the possibility of all such needs to be erased. So women must first and foremost think of surviving, and liberty, the idea of freedom, they will come much, much later, if at all. And that is something Atwood very successfully shows. There is the idea of resistance. There is this idea of humanity as we ideally understand it. All these ideas are there, all these ideas are relevant, but once again, history is conspicuous. How Gilead became Gilead, you do not have a lot of details, because that is the project that the oppressive regime would follow. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening to this, cluttered kind of a discussion.